What is rate-limiting factor? The definition. A rate-limiting factor is a factor that directly speeds up a chemical reaction when the supply of that factor increases. For illustration purposes at the start, an increase in X will result in an increase in the rate of reaction, so X is a limiting factor. However, it is only a limiting factor until the point where an increase in X no longer causes the curve to go any higher, or in other words, the rate of reaction will not go any faster. After this point, X is no longer a limiting factor. In chemical reactions, normally there will be several factors that can influence the rate of reaction. If we increase the temperature by 10 degrees Celsius, you can see that the rate of reaction can go faster. So we can say that on the red curve, at the flat part, temperature is a limiting factor, while for the initial part of the blue curve, both X and temperature are the limiting factors. For the flat part of the blue curve, we can't really comment on the temperature since we are not sure if an increase in temperature will increase the rate of reaction, but we can certainly say that X is not a limiting factor. How scientists set up experiment to study rate of photosynthesis. A generic setup would have your water plant in a water bath. This setup can be used to determine the effect of varying light intensity by setting up a light source. Light intensity can be changed by changing the distance of the lamp to the water plant. Carbon dioxide concentration by adding carbonate into the solution, as well as temperature by increasing or decreasing the temperature of the water bath. Light intensity. For an increase in light intensity, you will see a curve that has an initial linear increase before the rate of photosynthesis increases at a decreasing rate. You will need to explain that the increase due to increased light intensity is due to an increase in the supply of energy to be converted into chemical energy to reduce CO2 into glucose. Increased light intensity also increases the rate of photolysis to get more hydrogen ions to reduce carbon dioxide. The graph will then plateau, which is a fancy way of saying the rate stopped increasing. This is because, after a certain luminosity, light intensity is no longer a limiting factor, while other factors such as temperature and CO2 concentration can be the limiting factors. You will need to increase those factors to see if the rate of photosynthesis will increase. How carbon dioxide concentration affects rate of photosynthesis. This is the curve. I am showing the light intensity curve. No, take a look at the axis label, they are so clearly different. For those who don't understand sarcasm, the light intensity and CO2 curves are actually similar. The explanation of the initial increase is because carbon dioxide is the substrate or raw material for photosynthesis. If the concentration of substrate increases, the chance of them bumping into enzymes and hydrogen, forming ES complexes, also increases. When the graph plateaus, CO2 is no longer a limiting factor, and other factors such as temperature and light intensity can be the limiting factor. Temperature. The graph of rate of photosynthesis against temperature is a typical curve of an enzyme temperature graph. You have the exponential increase until the optimum temperature, where temperature is no longer a limiting factor before the sharp decrease. The increase is because photosynthesis is an enzyme-catalyzed reaction, and the increase in temperature increases the kinetic energy of enzyme and substrate, which leads to an increased collision rate of carbon dioxide and H+ ions, with the enzyme forming ES complexes. Beyond the optimum temperature, the enzyme will start to denature, losing its active site, and the rate of reaction decreases. A graph increasing light intensity and two different concentrations of carbon dioxide is not an uncommon sight. At the plateau, like always, the light intensity is no longer a limiting factor. However, for the red curve at the plateau, we can see that CO2 concentration is a limiting factor, since an increase in concentration will increase the reaction. Not surprisingly, CO2 concentration is also a limiting factor at the initial increase of the red curve. However, for the blue, the only conclusive observation is that light intensity is a limiting factor, since we are not sure if an increase in CO2 will increase the reaction even further. Light intensity, carbon dioxide and temperature. It is also possible to get a graph with all three factors. So we have the basic light intensity curve with CO2 at 0.03% and 20 degrees Celsius. Comparing it to the curve at 30 degrees Celsius, the temperature is a limiting factor at the plateau. Compare it to the curve at 0.06%. CO2, the concentration of carbon dioxide, is the limiting factor at the plateau of the red dotted curve. Lastly, compare it to the blue curve, where 0.06% CO2 and 30 degrees Celsius, both CO2, concentration and temperature, are the limiting factors at the plateau of the red dotted line. If we compare the blue dotted curve and solid blue curve, temperature is the limiting factor at the plateau of the dotted curve. Of course, light intensity is no longer a limiting factor at all the plateaus.